Hi, everybody, and welcome to our last lecture, 3-7. And this is Applications to Business. And we're going to talk about consumer and producer surplus. We have our demand curve, which is this line right here. And we have our supply line right there. And where they meet is called our equilibrium point. The demand curve is decreasing, that's the yellow. Lower prices mean higher quantities are demanded. This is price and this is quantity. So let's say this is our price. If I follow this over and down, this is my quantity. If I choose a bigger price, my quantity is smaller. The lower the price, the higher the quantity demanded. And the higher the price, the lower the quantities demanded. Then we have the supply curve. The supply curve is the green curve. And we can see that the supply curve is increasing. The lower the price, the lower the quantity supplied. If I have a low price, here's my quantity. If I have a lower price, my quantity is smaller because I don't want to supply as much. On this graph, the point where the demand curve and the supply curve cross is called the equilibrium point. This is my equilibrium. The equilibrium point is the point where the supply and the demand are equal. The definitions of consumer surplus is in blue. And it's the difference between what the consumer pays and what he would have been willing to pay. The definition of producer surplus is the difference between the price a firm receives and the price it would be willing to sell it for. But there's quite a few suppliers that would be happy to charge less. They will supply less. If a firm would sell a good at $4, but the market price is $7, the producer surplus is $3. Suppose that the price is set at the equilibrium price so that the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. The consumers on the left, which is our blue, would have been willing to pay a higher price than they ended up having to pay. So the equilibrium price saved them money. The producers on the left, that's this pink area, would have been willing to supply those goods for a lower price. My equilibrium price is higher than what the producers would be willing to sell it for. So if we sell for equilibrium, they make more money than they expected to. Both groups ended up with extra cash in their pockets. Graphically, the amount of extra money that ended up in consumers' pockets is the area between the demand curve and the horizontal line at P. That is the blue area again, and that's my consumer surplus. And the amount of extra money that ended up in producers' pockets is the area between the supply curve and the horizontal line at P. If I want to find the area in blue, I want to integrate 0 to my equilibrium quantity of the demand function minus the price at equilibrium. D of Q minus the equilibrium price with respect to Q. If I simplify this, this is the same as the integral from 0 to the equilibrium quantity of D of Q with respect to Q minus P is just a constant. That's my equilibrium price. And if I integrate that with respect to Q, I would just get PQ. And I would use my equilibrium for both, which is where this formula is coming from. The producer surplus is going to be different because it's the pink part. I want this area. Well, I start with my top curve. I'm going to integrate. My top curve is the equilibrium price, and I'm going to subtract the supply curve with respect to Q. I'm going to integrate that from 0 to the equilibrium constant. I can split this into two different integrals, and when I do, P asterisk is really just a constant, so that's going to equal P Q, that's my equilibrium price, minus the integral from 0 to the equilibrium quantity of the supply curve, whatever that is. And notice that happens to be how I find my producer surplus. And the sum of the consumer's surplus and the producer's surplus is the total gains from trade. Suppose the demand for a product is given by P equals D of Q, which is equal to negative 0.8 Q plus 150, and the supply for the same product is given by the price equals S of Q, which is 5.2 times Q. For both functions, Q is the quantity and P is the price in dollars. For A, I need to find my equilibrium point. Remember on the graph, the equilibrium point is the point where they meet. Where they meet, they're equal. I want this P to equal this P, which is the same as saying the demand function equals the supply function. Negative 0.8 Q plus 150 is equal to 5.2 Q. And now I just solve for Q. I'm going to add 0.8 Q to both sides. This will cancel. I get 150 is equal to 6 Q is equal to 150 divided by 6. Q equals 25. My equilibrium quantity is 25. I can now find my equilibrium price by plugging 25 back into either one of the two equations, because remember, they're equal. I'll just say equals 5.2 times 25. That is equal to $130. That's my equilibrium price. That's the final answer for A. B, find the consumer surplus at the equilibrium price. The consumer surplus is equal to the integral from 0 to the equilibrium quantity, which is 25, of the demand function, and our demand function is negative 0.8 Q plus 150 dQ minus the equilibrium price times the equilibrium quantity. If I integrate negative 0.8 Q, I get negative 0.8 Q squared divided by 2 plus 150 Q evaluated between 0 and 25 minus 130 times 25. Negative 0.8 times 25 squared divided by 2. I can simplify this to 0.4 times 25 squared plus 150 times 25. I would normally have to subtract the 0, but that's just 0 minus 130 times 25. And this is equal to negative 250 plus 3750 minus 3250. And this is equal to $250. My consumer surplus is $250. C. Find the producer's surplus at the equilibrium price. The consumer surplus was E asterisk Q asterisk, price and quantity at equilibrium, minus the integral from 0 to Q asterisk, which is 25, of the surplus. And the surplus is 5.2 Q dQ. This is 130 times 25 minus 5.2 Q squared divided by 2, evaluated between 0 and 25. 130 times 25 is 3250 minus 5.2 divided by 6 is 2.6. 25 squared, and if I plug in 0, I just get 0. This is equal to 3250 minus 1625 is equal to 1625. That is my producer surplus at equilibrium. Now we want to know what these two numbers mean. We got a consumer surplus of $250. That is the difference between what the consumer pays and what he would have been willing to pay. So he's saving $250. The definition of the producer surplus is the difference between the price a firm receives and the price it would be willing to sell at. The producer at equilibrium would be making $1,625 more than he expected.